I tend to very much focus on like, okay, how do I have the conversation behind the scenes with my reports and coach them and mentor them and try to smooth over their concerns is
Welcome back to another episode of the Leadership Lab. I'm Henry Kirk.
I'm Jonathan Aronson.
And we're joined with our very first guest, Michael. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Michael Avrukin. I'm an engineering manager at Google. I've known Henry from my time at Google.
Michael, how did you land in management and why did you decide to take the leap into becoming a manager?
Oh, God, I think there's multiple factors involved. Factor number one is that so I started writing code when I was very young. Like I was like 16, 17 years old and I was already writing code, and then had my first like proper internship when I was 20, and then I did my first startup at 21. And then I sort of moved on from there. And to be sort of honest about it, I plateaued from a learning technical perspective fairly early on. So by the time I was like in my 22, 23 type of area, I was like already like plateauing out in terms of learning new things, and I sort of wasn't being challenged. At the same time, I was within an organization where there just wasn't good management leadership. Like my direct manager never written code in his professional life. He was like a PhD in mechanical engineering, and he just sort of became like a people manager, but he really just had very, very little actual like concrete, like this is how software gets built. And so it was very frustrating because he didn't have good leadership there. And so as time went on, like the opportunities presented to become like a TL, and then I mentor people and then group people, and I realized I actually enjoy a little bit of the mentoring and growing people thing phase. And so later on, as I sort of continued to grow and develop in that mentorship and developing, and I coached, and there were more and more of like people that I coached and developed, that those opportunities suddenly presented themselves in terms of going into management. And there was a couple of very clear points where I was like, okay, like you're going to have to start managing now. And so I did. And then I just sort of stuck with it. Now, for full transparency, I'm likely leaving Google, but the next thing I'm doing may actually wind up not being doing people management, because I actually maybe want to take a step back for a little while from actually doing that and dig in a little bit more in terms of doing more of the technical problems and doing more a little bit of um, of the organizational leadership, but not from a people management perspective, but from a more technical perspective. And that's one thing where I have to credit Google, is before coming to Google, I had never really seen senior ICs being able to really lead and being empowered to lead and being able to influence and get the right things done. Too often I found that the moment you weren't the moment you were an IC, doesn't matter how senior of an IC you were, you had no say in the direction of the product, you had no say in the direction of the priorities. At the end of the day, it was very much like, you're the IC, we're the managers, we're going to tell you what to do. And it was company after company after company that I saw that sort of dynamic. And in Google, that's not the case. At Google, they really did a great job of, in a way, of reversing that and essentially saying, no, like the ICs are deep in the trenches. They understand what's going on. And you as a manager, your job is to empower your ICs to succeed and really set the direction, bring them into the fold, and have them, they're involved in the direction setting and in the product direction. And seeing that play out, and I think that's now become more popular across more tech companies. I think that, at least for me personally, may wind up suiting what I do next better, in terms of being more on the mentoring and coaching side, not having to do the performance reviews, not having to do the promo committees and all that kind of stuff, and be able to just focus on like, okay, doing the coaching, the mentoring, and the technical leadership. And I think that's what I will likely be doing next. Hopefully, be doing next, but we'll see how things play out. No promises. But effectively, the way I went into, just let me wrap it up. The way I went into management was a little bit out of necessity, was a little bit out of the organizational structures that existed, and a little bit out of like enjoying what I did, which was the coaching and mentoring piece. I think that's the story.
Yeah, so we have an interesting topic today. Michael and Henry worked together over at Google, and they were leading two teams, and we thought it would be interesting to talk about how two teams that have come from completely different areas but are in the same building come together to work together on a common project. So cross collaborations with teams that aren't necessarily connected with each other, but and then how leadership impacted how those two teams would work. So that's kind of what the topic is today, and hopefully you'll find it interesting.
Awesome, great. So, how do we want to start this?
I can set up
Why
the
don't
context. Yeah, do you want me to do
Okay,
that?
sure.
Sure.
yeah, let's do
Okay, so I'll
that.
set up the context. So I manage effectively two teams: the Sheets infrastructure team. It's about 80% of my time, and the Sheets mobile team, which is about 20% of my time. The Sheets mobile team is one of the challenges it has is that it's always short on staffing, which is very common across many teams, but this team is particularly short on staffing. Over the years, it also accumulated a fair amount of debt, whereby the iOS feature set just kept falling behind and behind where Android was, and we started getting a lot of grumblings from our customers, from our users. Hey, they're like, "Hey, things like keyboard shortcuts don't work, or other features just are not there on par." And so I started just trying to scour the universe in terms of Google of like who can I find to help out with, and then through a weird set of coincidences, we got to not Henry, but we got to Luke, who was I think Henry's manager at the time, and Luke then said, "Yeah, go talk to Henry." And it turned out that Henry had this whole special team within Google whose entire focus was to help teams like us improve our products and ship them better. And so they said, "Okay, like go work together, figure it out." And I said, "Great." The problem is that um, despite what it might look like on the outside, Google is just a complete mess on the inside. Everything's being held by duct tape, and except for the fact that both me and Henry happen to be in the same building, eating in the same cafeterias, we literally have like nothing in common in terms of like organizational structures, how we make decisions, how we cooperate. But at the same time, here we are, sort of under the same roof. We can actually work together, and so that's how we got initially connected. And then Henry, do you want to go from there in terms of like what how that wound up playing out and what we wound
Yeah,
up
I
doing?
think it took us what, like 5 months to get approval to move forward with the project, if I was
I think
right.
so.
Like it
Yeah.
was ridiculously long. That's
Yeah.
that's what I thought was really interesting is that like, Michael and I were both, engineering managers that were always trying to push projects and try to make things move forward. I felt like that was, well, it's a big part of our job anyway, but it was always all the red tape around trying to do the right thing for the user, the company, whatever it is. And so it's interesting that, uh, having a like somebody on the other side in that other team like Michael that wanted to move things forward as opposed to like what would typically happen is I'm trying to chase that other team's manager to say, hey, yeah, let's work together. So like Michael was very for it, but the dynamics within the company and all that other red tape there made it very, very challenging to kind of like to work together. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Not only that, like we effectively had on the sheet side, we had like this massive list of like, if we magically had somebody help us out to improve the product, here's the list of things. If we could only find somebody, so it wasn't even like we needed to like close the gap on what those things would be. Like we had that list, we knew what it needed to be. We still couldn't get do as Henry put it, the right thing for the users. It was
Yeah, it was
ridiculously
wild.
What was the obstacle that you really felt mostly that you were running into?
I don't know. Henry, do you want to?
If my memory serves me right, it was the product managers trying to prioritize or the leaders trying to prioritize what we would actually work on.
Yeah, I
And then
think
it
that's
was also that like, well, who is this team that's going to be writing code in our code base? Like, how do we know that they're going to actually produce quality
So
and do stuff like
mistrust.
that?
So there
I
was
would
some
think so.
mistrust going on there and some prioritization.
yeah. The interesting thing is, this is something that I've struggled with getting people to really buy into. Is that for a long time, this changed over the last year or two, but for the long time, Google had a single hiring bar that it had for everybody. Didn't matter where you were, whether you're being hired in Zurich or Dublin or New York or San Francisco. There was a very set bar for what it meant to be a Google software engineer. And the advantage of that was that you number one had trust, implicit trust. People there were at sort of this caliber, And number two, you could move people around the organization without having them to re-interview for new roles and new positions. And so I would constantly emphasize this to my team. I would tell them, listen, you know, as long as this person from this other team, they met the same bar you met, they're the same standard you're at, they're working the same code base, you can effectively implicitly trust them. And yet somehow when the rubber hit the road, there was, as you put it this way, there was that sort of inherent mistrust within the organization. And so at least on my end, I had to constantly keep like rehashing, be like, okay, you don't know the person, but trust the system. And it's one of those obstacles that it's hard to overcome, I think.
Yeah. Why do you think that existed, Michael? Like I've saw that for my 8 years at Google. Why do you think that existed in an organization like that?
You well, which part do you think in terms of like?
Just the lack of trust across teams, in like inherent trust across teams.
I don't have a good answer for that. I will say that I found that whenever you had someone come from the other team and join yours, whatever that other team X, let's say we were workspace and somebody came in and joined our team from search, and another person joined from search. All of a sudden, you're like, oh yeah, those people in search are great, right? And you had somebody coming from ads. Oh yeah, those people from ads are great. The moment you actually got someone from that other team to join your team and what through whatever capacity and you work with them, the stigma went down. So I think it very much is the reality that at the end of the day, maybe that's the case. That although we were in this one building under one roof, there really wasn't very much interaction, right? You never really ventured beyond the 50 or 100 person bubble that you were operating in, even though you had 5,000 people in the building.
So I kind of define trust as being able to do something, being believable to do it, connected to do it, and being dependable to do it. The four elements of trust. Which one? It sounds like maybe the connection wasn't there until the people, the individuals would come to work on the team. What do you think of that? And what do you? Is there anything else when I'm thinking of these ABCDs that might come into play here as well?
I think that's a big overwhelming element. In the end of the day, I think you're right. As again, as much as it looks like the same organization, in practice, you don't really see these people. You don't really, no one goes into the cafeteria, grabs their lunch, and just picks a random table and be like, "Hi, I'm Michael. Tell me about what you're working on." Like people don't really do that on a day
Because
to day basis.
engineers are so chatty.
Exactly right. So breaking out of that bubble that you're in, or breaking out of those organizational silos that you're in, um, is hard. And so I think there is that element. Yeah, I see that person walking down the hall, and the reason I know them is because they're 6'8", and obviously you recognize a 6'8" person in the office, but otherwise you mostly don't really see or recognize the same people.
Do you think it has something to do with the way our performance was evaluated?
In what way? Like what do you think about? Like
Well,
what element do you think of it?
if you're evaluated, let's say on certain metrics like quality, user satisfaction, and things like that, do you think that that might cause some of the kind of like walled garden, so to speak, around these teams where they're very careful about who they allow in? Or do you think it's really just they need to get to know the person first and it's a relationship issue?
Um, I think there's a different element in terms of the performance review. I think you're always a little bit in the lookout for what could sacrifice my performance review, what could get in the way of my performance review, right? And so if the more senior you become, the more protective I think you become of like those check boxes that of what how you can demonstrate impact, and having to go out and spend time building a relationship with another team that you really don't know, and the relationship would not be very long term, and the benefit of that engagement can really only maybe get you some points on the next perf cycle, and afterwards it's sort of gone and it's not there anymore. So it's very hard to be committed to investing in that when you know that I can achieve effectively the same impact influence type of metrics through other means, through less risky means. They're going to have more payoff in the long term. But if you think about it this way, let's say let's put it into I'm not going to mention the person's name, but into the Sheets TL's um, perspective, he's now tasked with trying to work with this team and invest a whole bunch of energy to driving and drive that relationship with this other team. But that's going to last for 3 months, maybe 6 months, and then what? That relationship is done and it's over with. And so, can you use it for promos? Not really. Can you use it for other perf? Not really. It has, I think, that element of short duration with high cost element
I
to it.
see. So that could be part of the reason where they're just looking at the cost benefit, maybe, of
Maybe I
like,
think that
is
could
it
be.
worth it?
Yeah,
Interesting.
maybe. I'm coming up with a theory. This is my hypothesis is
Hmm.
as an element.
So looking ahead or moving forward, how did you? I mean, you said once they started working together, they started to gel a bit more and connect. But I'm curious, you two as leaders, did you influence that process at all? And if so, what actions were you taking?
Henry, do you want to jump in? Because I'll give you my perspective afterwards. I started
Yeah,
I started the previous one. Then go ahead. You.
yeah, sure. I think that we were very instrumental and influential. I think that so my team's goal was to help out other teams and find projects. And so the first project that I think we even scoped it back, Michael, if I remember right, to something very small because I wanted to prove that we could handle the end to end project, work in a code base we're unfamiliar with, and show the senior leadership that our team was capable of doing really good, and then we would build a long-term relationship after that. So I mean, that was always the goal that I had, and so I approached it in that way. And so had Michael or myself probably not been there, I don't think it would have actually moved forward. I don't think it would have ever gotten done.
Yeah. So my approach is to try. I feel that my approach is different than most Googlers because um, I tend to very much focus on like, okay, how do I have the conversation behind the scenes with my reports and coach them and mentor them and try to smooth over their concerns as best as I possibly can. That tends to be my approach. Essentially, I sit there in a one-on-one, I listen to their concerns, and then I give them some ideas. I don't solve the problems for them, but maybe give them some coaching tidbits. On occasion, I'll roll up my sleeves and get involved in the problem if it looks like that's the only way forward. But otherwise, I try to coach them and give them strategies, give them ways of thinking about the issue. And so I think there was a fair amount, at least in the beginning, of friction of like trying to find that mesh. And I kept constantly sort of, to the TL on the team saying, hey, like, how about this approach? Or how about, try to communicate this issue? Or how about you raise this thing? Don't be afraid to raise your concern this way. Don't be afraid to raise your concern that way. And I think getting those things out of the way was important. And despite how I think there was a level of frustration, I would let my report vent to me, and I would just sort of take it and bucket it in, and I would just sort of move on. And then the occasion would drop Henry and be like, "Hey, like, can we move this thing a little bit forward, or do that something like that?" And not get all of the other frustration behind the scenes, sort of.
This is really interesting that we're talking about this because I didn't know a lot of the behind the scenes work that you had to do on your
Manipulation. I saw
side.
manipulation.
Yeah, I was
Yeah.
just saying manipulation, right? It's
Yeah.
versus what I had to do on my team. It's interesting. I mean, we would talk about the problems, and I remember it'd be like, oh, so and says, this is it, and we have to solve the challenge. But it's interesting that you had to do just as much work as I did to kind of like get things going. But mine was not on my team side. Mine was trying to convince senior leadership, not outside of my org, that it was the right thing to do. Where Michael was trying to even just convince his own team that it was okay to do. I think it's kind of interesting.
Yeah, it wasn't that it was the right or wrong thing to do. It's just that it was a matter of like, well, how much resources do we spend on this? How much, I think the promise was that this would be, a 20% involvement on our end. And the challenge is that when it required more hand holding, especially in the beginning, I think there was that disappointment. And so I had to say, listen, when you're starting these projects initially, there's always a high startup cost. But the more you invest up front, the more you get it out of the way, the more you really focus on it. Forget about the other things. Don't worry about the other things. Do that investment up front now that you can really seed the garden properly. You will see the reward pay off in the future, right? So playing the long game, playing constantly the long game, I think is difficult, but that's always been my strategy. Like, play the long game, don't worry about the short game. Play the long game, invest in the people, invest in the relationship, invest in the cooperation. And hey, listen, it might take you 2 months, it might take you 3 months. Fine, I understand. It's going to hit our roadmap, it's going to hit our deliverables, our OKRs are going to suffer, but then you're going to be able to leverage this new thing moving forward. And I think doing that kind of thing was what I was very much focused on, and getting that message landed isn't always easy, but I think that's the thing that needs to happen.
I, Out of curiosity, did you two teams? Did you bring the teams together at any point where you did introductions? Here's our team members. Here's our key people. Here's the expectation. We'd like to hear from you what concerns you have. What are the challenges? How do you feel about working together that we could help support you? Did any of that go on?
A little bit.
Yes, we did do that in the beginning. I think, let's say this way. I think we could have done it better. I think a lot of it did
Yeah.
happen virtually. I think we could have done it more face to face. I think that's an excellent example of where uh, being face to face is better than being virtual. But I think we did do a fair amount of that. Um, but there's also sort of, once you the metal hits the, once the rubber hits the road and you start doing the work, you start surfacing very different elements of the relationship than you did when you did those introductions. I think everybody is generally polite, and everybody's generally
Yeah,
fine.
best
Everybody can,
behavior. First date.
exactly, for everybody can do first and second and third date perfectly fine. It's like,
Yeah.
it's not until you get to the 10th day that you certainly start seeing, the real cracks,
Mm.
and I think that's what the reality is.
Yeah. So I wonder, we talk a lot about the show around conversational capacity, which is basically using candor with curiosity or setting up a framework of communication.
Yeah.
With what's your thoughts, Michael, on using a process or explaining a process when you encounter conflict down the road? How are you going to talk through that conflict?
Yeah, so laying, essentially what you're saying is, what's our approach to laying down the rules of the game, even in terms of conflict resolution, even before we get to the conflict.
Right. How do we go about it? The process for working through conflict.
I think it's a great idea. I think it's super important. You just have to, but you want to, if you're going to do it when you're doing that introduction session of merging the teams, so then you probably have to cut out, 2 to 3 hours for that initial engagement, which at Google is hard. Um, but you say you cut out those 2 3 hours and you lay out the first half hour introductions and icebreakers, and then you talk about the project, and then it's sometime in hour 1.5 you say, hey, we are going to have conflicts, and let's simulate how we would address those conflicts, and let's use this framework. And then you have to
Right.
do a few of those rehearsals of, 2 3 exercises just to get through the whole thing. And so I think that would be fine. I think it's actually probably a really good idea, honestly. It just,
It saved time on the background, wouldn't it? In
yeah,
the back end, like
yeah,
because that's what
Yeah.
slows down the project. We Henry and I were talking and saying this is kind of an interesting situation, but by actually being intentional as leaders, bringing the team together, recognizing you're on your first date. Hi, really great to be here. In 10th date, we're gonna have problems. Okay,
right,
that's just going to happen. There's
Mm.
going to be competing priorities or it's going to be differences of opinion. So let's really get it out now how we're going to get through that storming phase, as it said, so we can get more to an integration of working together.
Yeah.
You
yeah,
That's
know,
a really good idea. I kind of feel like when I was constant, because I was pitching with lots of teams constantly, and getting the yes was very hard. But once we got that yes, usually it was a long lift to get to that yes, and then we had to kind of move forward.
yeah,
And I think that, yeah, I don't think we talked about this, Michael, but if had we at that time said, hey, like, let's anticipate issues and let's try to get the team, let's like form a little team bond and culture, and maybe like just an hour of just getting to know each other sort of thing before we actually start, as opposed to like hi, I'm Henry, I lead this team, and all right, now this is what we're going to be doing together.
Right.
And then that could be even the first time that some people heard about that, perhaps.
Uh, I mean, on my end, not really. Like I sort of seeded a fair amount of it for a while. Um, the the biggest problem, I think, I wouldn't say the biggest. One of the bigger challenges at Google is that Googlers tend to sort of be more in the cerebral side, and so whenever you push this idea of like, well, we're going to do a culture thing, we're going to do a bit of a touchy feeling exercise, they tend to just sort of like bristle a little bit at the idea. And yet, when you force them into it and they go through it, they're like, oh, that was such a great thing that we did. Why don't we do some more of it? And it's like it's very hard, but at the same time, I think it's super valuable to be able to have done that. As you said, like, hey, let's get in the room, we'll introduce each other, let's talk about it, let's actually grab lunch together, you know, and
Create a connection.
yeah, exactly, yeah,
Yeah, yeah, really important. And the thing is that the leaders set the tone, right?
yeah,
So you and Henry have the ability in this case to say, okay, you know, as your leaders, this is what we're gonna do, and um, yeah, I get you'd get pushback. I mean, I coach a lot of engineers, and meeting new people is not necessarily an easy situation, but as a leader to support them through Michael, quite frankly, your coaching, phenomenal kind of way to approach it. Not, but when they were stuck, you gave direction. You said, well, what about doing this and doing that? And so that's where the leadership is so important, because if you just throw teams together without any kind of leadership, you're just going to get stuck. Things are not going to progress forward. You're going to eat up a lot of time. It's going to be a lot of waste of energy, and people are going to get frustrated,
yeah.
So,
Henry, can I ask you a question? I mean, now you're
Sure.
dealing a lot with this in terms of getting your customers onboarded, right? And so you get some of those initial projects going, but then as Jonathan points out, you are going to have conflict at some point in time, especially for bigger, longer running projects.
Oh yeah.
You know,
Yeah,
how do you?
we've already had it
We already
a
had that.
couple
So like,
times. I've only been in business like 120 days, and we're
right,
already
exactly.
learning and yeah, trying to go through that. Yeah.
So do you try maybe? I mean, this is actually honestly, I've never seen a company do that, but like when they're setting up the relationship to be like, okay, we are going to have conflict, we are going to have disagreements. This is how we're going to address it. Like, have you tried that with your customers? Do you
I
think
think
that?
I'm going to try this like later today with my next like client meeting and bring it up. But what's really what one of the dynamics that we had to deal with that we hadn't faced as a team yet was, so working with a direct client and their immediate team. I was very comfortable because it was no different than like working with you. It was just, get to know them, demonstrate good work and be organized as best we can. But what ended up causing a little bit of friction that we dealt with was another contractor or another agency brought into the fold. And that was something that none of my team, except maybe like one or two, had dealt with. I had dealt with it in previous relationships, but then you have different power dynamics there because they don't know who we are. They want to do a really good job. There's very little trust. There's not enough time to do it. And so what I kept telling everyone is grab a one-on-one with that person. Say, hi, this is what I am. This is what my goals are.
Yeah,
I want to be aligned on our goals. And then as soon as they started doing that, the tension went down because the meetings used to be, there was a couple meetings that we would have where some people would get a little thrown under the bus. And then as soon as I heard that happen, they were like, "What the heck just happened?" I'm like, "This is why this is happening, guys. We got to go do this." And it worked. But that was when it first like triggered it, and everyone was like completely taken aback. So yeah,
yeah. Because both of you are effectively competing for the same business, and the vantage
correct.
point is that the pie is only so big. So if I let my competitor, you know, do a super great job or don't undermine them a little bit, that like I'm losing a piece of the pie.
Yeah,
And
especially if there's
everybody is,
overlap too
yeah,
in like what they do in some way, or you have to collaborate, and
yeah,
you don't know these people,
yeah.
so it's hard. But yeah, I think it would have been valuable if they had brought us together and said, hey, let's do a little. I'm going to do that for sure next time. Be like, oh well, since we're all let's what is everyone's
I,
favorite food and place to go, and try to just spark random conversation.
Yeah,
so when I'm working with teams, and there's a few things that we establish when talking with them. The first, whenever we're doing uh, an opening session, it's like, tell us a fun fact about you. Something just to break the ice, right? Because people are people, and it's kind of fun. Like I am a beer judge, a craft beer judge, and I get paid to do that. And people are like, oh, really? And all of a sudden they're not just seeing me as the ad in an adversarial, way. And what you're really doing is you want to build that trust, and you can't do it without one some encouragement by leaders to bring that into play, and to allow people to just start to connect and to get to know each other. I think once you can do that, then anything is possible, and it's going to move a lot quicker. But without it, you're going, who is this person? What are they
yeah,
about? Can I believe them? Can they do the job? If I need something, are they going to be dependable?
right.
So, really important elements to be intentional about in any kind of team environment, whether it's cross collaboration or within the exact team. And think of it when you get new team members coming in, that people don't know. It's kind of the same thing, right? Who is this guy coming in? I mean, is he going to be a good partner or a bad partner? Are we going to have to get divorced early? Like what's going on? So, so that's a really important concept to keep in mind, and you're confirming it just with this experience.
Jonathan, can I ask you an interesting question? I think my observation is that I think everybody has had a really awful experience with somebody that just really undermined their trust and really like made them like
Hmm.
hurt them. I wouldn't say even maybe hurt them, but just left them with a really awful experience and taste. And whenever we come to to a situation, our default for this is at least what I've observed is to ascribe the worst possible thing we've experienced so far to like this new person. Like, how do we overcome that? How do we overcome some of those like negative experiences in the new relationships, in the new dynamics?
With somebody new coming in,
Yeah, essentially, I think my experience is that nobody starts off in these new dynamics being like, okay, I know nothing about the person, so they've got 0 points. I'm just going to treat them as like fair game and everything's fair. Good and neutral. Effectively, everybody starts off with like, I'm going to start off with like negative a million because I know nothing about this person. Whatever my negative a million from past experiences is like that's
yeah,
what I'm going to give this new person, and then like they have to crawl their way up to zero and then maybe up into the positive. Like, why is that, and like how do you like get people to shift
got
out
it.
of?
Well, yeah, great question. So, you're bringing your baggage with you, right? Is what this really is about. In any relationship, when you're bringing your baggage, it's getting in the way. Again, this is the opportunity for leadership to influence that. You don't have any control over anyone, right? Over any of your reports, so they're going to do and act the way they want. But I really feel from a leadership standpoint, if you sit with them and say, give this guy a chance, just let's start neutral. I know we've had some problems with other people, but everybody's a different individual. And here's one great way to kind of put it to the team member: if you were the new guy coming in, how would you want to be treated, or at least initially, evaluated, from the new team members? Because then you're putting them in the other person's shoes.
Mhm.
And that's where empathy really comes into play. And we talk about this all the time, Henry and I lead with empathy, right? So by introducing the idea of empathy to your reports when somebody new comes in, will help overcome that trust issue or bringing the baggage with them.
Start wrapping it up. What do you think?
Sounds good.
Sounds good today.
I think that the biggest thing that sort of landed with me is number one. There's two things. Number one, we probably should have done like a proper session of just let's get together, even though we're in the same building, we're really not in the same mindset. So I would think that was one thing that we could have done differently. But the other one is, which is really fascinating, and I didn't think about it until Jonathan, you brought it up, which is have a framework for conflict resolution and have it up front and discuss it and have it laid out and practice it maybe even a little bit in some simulated scenarios. Because when you do hit a conflict, it's too late. Like I fly planes on the side as a hobby. You do beers, I do planes, and you practice your emergency procedures like over and over and over again, so that when they do happen, like it's more of an instinct than anything else. I've had a few happen, and so the first one that it happened, I was freaked out, and I was like, oh wait, training kicks in. I got it. And then the second time,
Yeah.
essentially the same issue happened. I was like, oh, okay, whatever I did before. Click this button, do that, do this, move on. Right. So I think it's a matter of just doing that practice. And I think that's going to be my takeaway of like practice pulling the parachute, which is the conflict parachute, I would say. And then if you do that, then I think it's good.
Yeah. So you've had multiple emergency situations.
Not
Remind me
major.
not to like fly with you.
Let's not go flying with him.
Yeah,
No,
right.
they're mechanical issues that happen. I lost my alternator twice over the water, and it's not. It's like and once you like your training kicks in, and then your understanding of how the plane actually works, you're just like, oh, okay, great. So now I'm just gonna have to land without my radios and without GPS, but I know where the airport is and I can navigate, just visually
Okay,
outside.
good. Yeah, all right. I'm glad to fly with you after another 10,000 hours of practice. Or maybe when you get a new plane.
It's not my plane; it was rental, so
Oh, okay. All right, remind me not to use that company.
My takeaway really is based on this conversation. Really, is how important establishing trust is, and being intentional about how you're going to do it. Really can make a lot of difference, either within a team or when new team members come in. It's all that foundation of first focusing on that, and that leaders can really affect that change and help the people on their team build that trust faster. So
Right.
that was kind of my takeaway from this. What about
Yeah.
you, Henry?
I think my takeaway is I agree with both of your takeaways and assessments, but I think what is kind of interesting is that within a company, especially Google and other stuff, the focus on team unity is always within your own team, and I can't recall any of the group projects and trainings and classes that they offer that focused around cross team collaboration, and I think that like. Yes, I learned that some more strategies that I should have upfronted more of this. But I think that it's something that the organization should recognize as a whole and potentially try to encourage people to do. Because, Michael and I have been managing a long time. And even out of this, I'm like, oh, yeah, I should have done that. Like, it's just sometimes it's not always obvious. And I'm glad I learned something new today. But I think organization, like if you're a leader of an organization of many groups and people, you should really try to just have these, even if there is no opportunity to work together. So that way when you do, or maybe they'll be more comfortable to come forward with an idea or something and collaborate. So like we talked about, like, hey, you don't just go sit down at lunch and say, hi, I'm so-and-so, what do you do? Like maybe you could start encouraging that because they end up knowing people because they've worked on that. So I think it's a really great. It's good. I think at startups, big organizations, anyone could benefit from that sort of thing.
Yeah. Let me add one sort of quick final thought. When I look back professionally, the organization that actually retrospectively had the biggest impact on me was actually LinkedIn when I worked there. And the reason is that even when they were like 200, 250 people, they always found a way to do trainings and to develop their people. And to this day, for my performance management checklist, I use what LinkedIn gave me. They have this. There's this company called Blessing White. They do these trainings, and I have the binder still at my desk, and I have this checklist that I scanned in, and I'm like, okay, if somebody's not doing well, like, here's my checklist. And they really invested in people and in training. And I think when you're in the organization, invest in your people, invest in the trainings like this one. If you could take what Jonathan's doing and bring it into an organization, be like, hey, we're going to do a simulated conflict resolution thing and work on conflict resolution across the organization and teach everybody a certain framework, I think it'd be amazing, right? But it's not something that Google does.
That's true. And funny you mention that because Jonathan actually does that. And if anyone is interested, you could reach out to him by clicking the link in the description.
Great segue to end today's.
Yeah,
Thank you
so much.
Anyway,
Awesome.
take
Cool.
care.
Well, Michael, I really, really appreciate you joining us today and being our very first guest on the podcast. So if
Yay.
you have gotten this far, thank you so much. We appreciate it. And please hit the like button and hit the subscribe button and the bell button, any other buttons they start adding on. Just hit it so that way you can encourage us to have more guests on the show, have more topics that you're interested in. But this has been really fantastic. So thank you again, Michael.
Sounds good. Thank you so much. Have a
Awesome.
wonderful day.